The world was reduced to three colors: the oppressive black of the sky, the skeletal white of birch trunks shattered by artillery, and the deep, rotten brown of the earth. This was the strip of hell east of Smolensk they called No Man's Land. The air didn't smell of gunpowder here. It smelled of decay, wet soil, and the coppery tang of old blood. A figure moved through this landscape of shadows and craters. Not a man, but a phantom, a liquid shape that flowed from one patch of darkness to the next. This was Nikolai Ivanov. His Soviet uniform was caked in a uniform layer of mud, making it look like a second skin of the earth itself. His face was a mask of grime and concentrated exhaustion, but his eyes, pale chips of ice, scanned the terrain with a terrifying, mechanical efficiency. His mission tonight was not to kill, but to steal an identity. 3 nights prior, a German probing attack had been slaughtered here. Among the dead was an Obergefreiter, a corporal, from a reconnaissance battalion. Intelligence suggested the man carried not just standard papers, but a personal letter. A letter from home, with an address, local gossip, the unique handwriting of a loved one. For Nikolai's legend to be ironclad, he needed such a fragment of real, intimate life. He found the body where the report said it would be, half submerged in a water-filled shell crater. The man was young, his face bloated and unrecognizable under a sheen of greenish film. Nikolai's movements were not hesitant, but brutally pragmatic. He checked the perimeter, his ears straining against the distant thunder of the front. Silence, save for the drone of flies. He rolled the corpse over. The uniform was sodden. His gloved hands moved to the inner breast pocket. Nothing. The side pockets. Empty. A cold knot tightened in his gut. Time was evaporating. The patrol schedule gave him a 20-minute window. He was already 12 minutes in. He forced himself to think like the dead man, a soldier, scared, wanting to keep his most precious thing safe. Nikolai's hands went to the man's belt, to the small damp pouch behind the main kit. His fingers closed around folded paper. He pulled it out. A water-stained envelope, the ink smeared but readable. An address in Breslau. The handwriting was a feminine cursive. Bingo. At that precise moment, the world erupted in blinding magnesium-white light. An enemy flare shot into the sky, hissing like an angry serpent. It popped, and a spectral swaying glow painted the wasteland in stark, moving shadows. Nikolai froze, becoming part of the earth. He was 10 meters from the crater's edge, exposed. The light turned the murky water around the corpse into a mirror, illuminating the horrific scene. He heard the voices first. Guttural German, casual, bored. A routine patrol, cutting through the edge of the dead zone. 2 shapes materialized at the tree line 30 meters to his west. They were smoking, their rifles slung. One of them laughed at something. Nikolai's mind went blank, then hyper-focused. Movement would be death. The corpse was his only camouflage. He lowered his head, pressing his mud-caked cheek against the cold, stiff uniform of the dead German. He closed his eyes to a slit, becoming another piece of the carnage. The stench was overwhelming. Sweet, cloying decay filled his nostrils, coated his tongue. He fought the convulsion in his throat. The beam of a flashlight, weak and yellow, swept over the crater. It lingered. It traveled up the dead man's legs, over his torso, and for a heart-stopping second, rested on the back of Nikolai's head, tangled in the dead man's arm. Nikolai held his breath. His lungs screamed. Every muscle was a coiled spring of raw terror. Scheisse, schon wieder voller Maden, one soldier muttered with disgust. The beam jerked away. The voices began to recede. The flare died, plunging the world back into blessed darkness, thicker than ink. Nikolai didn't move for a full minute. Then he erupted from the muck, gasping silent, ragged breaths that tore at his chest. He vomited a thin stream of bile into the mud. The tremor started in his hands, a violent, uncontrollable shaking. He clenched his fists, driving his nails into his palms until the pain cut through the panic. He had the letter. He was alive. The journey back was a blur of instinct and fear. He slipped through the Soviet forward post, a ghost returning from the land of the dead. He didn't go to a command bunker. He descended into the belly of a shattered city, into a cellar beneath a house with no roof. The space was a tomb of brick and cold. Colonel Volkov waited, a statue in the gloom of a single kerosene lamp. Nikolai entered not as a composed agent, but as a creature of the night, reeking of death and panic. He didn't speak. He threw the sodden, filthy letter onto the wooden table between them. It landed with a wet slap. Volkov didn't touch it. His eyes, old and flat as river stones, studied Nikolai. He saw the mud, the vomit stain on his jacket, the wild, unspent adrenaline still flickering in the younger man's eyes. He saw the tremor. Nikolai was fighting with every ounce of his will. Nikolai's real documents, a small, worn internal passport, a photograph of a woman with a gentle smile standing in front of a pre-war Leningrad apartment block, were already on the table. Volkov picked them up. He held the photograph to the lamplight. The woman's smile seemed impossibly distant, from another universe. Without ceremony, he touched the corner of the photo to the flame. The fire consumed the smile, the apartment, the memory. He then set the entire passport alight. Nikolai watched. This time he didn't just see the destruction of Nikolai Ivanov. He felt it as a physical tear inside his chest. The tremor in his hands returned, stronger. He hid them behind his back, ashamed of this betrayal by his own body. Volkov's voice cut the silence, low and hard, like grinding stone. He did not speak of Mother Russia or glory. He spoke of the anatomy of fear. He said that what Nikolai had just experienced in the crater, the primal animal terror, was a luxury, a poison. Out there, in the world of Nicholas von Berg, that fear would be a detectable scent. It would whisper to his enemies. It would linger in a moment of hesitation, in a wrong inflection in his voice. It would get him killed, and his death would be meaningless, a tiny, silent failure that would cause a cascade of other larger deaths behind the lines he was meant to protect. His task, Volkov said, was not to feel nothing. It was to build a prison for Nikolai Ivanov's terror, to construct a new man, Nicholas, from the cold, hard materials of discipline, memory, and a stolen life. The letter on the table was the first brick. Finally, Volkov slid the new identity across the table. The Soldbuch was crisp, authoritative. The photograph of von Berg showed a man with Nikolai's features, but colder, sharper, his hair perfectly parted. He looked like a stranger who shared Nikolai's bones. Nikolai reached for it. His hand, now steady through sheer force of will, closed around the booklet. The eagle and swastika were embossed, tangible under his thumb. This was his skin now. He turned and climbed out of the cellar. The pre-dawn light was a dirty gray smear in the sky. To the east, a deep, constant rumble. His home, his army, everything real. To the west, silence. And then the distant, mechanical sounds of the German rear. Nicholas von Berg, refugee, patriot, phantom, took a breath that no longer shook. He fixed the collar of his civilian jacket, felt the weight of the Soldbuch over his heart, and began to walk. Not with the stealth of a spy, but with the determined, weary tread of a man who had seen hell and was walking towards another, by choice. The first test was over. The longest walk of his life had just begun. The landscape west of Smolensk was a different kind of hell. It was the hell of order imposed on chaos. The roads were choked not with corpses, but with the machinery of occupation. Lumbering supply trucks, horse-drawn wagons with exhausted animals, columns of infantry marching with the grim, plodding rhythm of men who had seen too much. The air smelled of diesel, stale tobacco, and the sour sweat of an army in retreat. Nicholas von Berg moved through this river of Feldgrau not as an observer, but as a piece of human flotsam. His civilian clothes were now dusty and torn from a day and night of walking. He had practiced his story in his head 1,000 times, sanding down every detail until it felt like a remembered truth. He was a Balt, a German from Riga, his family executed by Bolsheviks, his property confiscated. He had worked as a mechanic, which explained his strong, capable hands. He carried a deep, silent hatred. He carried the letter from Breslau. The first test came at a makeshift checkpoint on a shattered bridge. A bored Landwehr soldier, his face young but his eyes old, held out a hand without looking up from a clipboard. Papers. Nicholas's heart hammered a single violent beat against his ribs. This was the moment. The tremor he had buried threatened to surface. He focused on the physical sensation of the Soldbuch in his inner pocket, the crispness of the paper. He handed it over, his movement deliberate, neither slow nor hurried. The soldier glanced at the photo, then up at Nicolais's face. The scrutiny lasted 3 seconds. In those seconds, Nicholas became von Berg. He allowed a flicker of impatience, of a man who had suffered indignities and was tired of more bureaucracy. He subtly squared his shoulders, a gesture of latent pride. The soldier grunted, stamped the booklet with a meaningless transit authority mark, and waved him through. No words. The first barrier had been a formality. It did not ease the tension. It coiled it tighter. The real army lay ahead. His opportunity came not from careful planning, but from the brutal randomness of war. A mile past the checkpoint, a German truck, a battered Opel Blitz, had skidded off the muddy road into a ditch. Its rear wheels spun uselessly, flinging gouts of black earth. A young officer, an Oberleutnant, stood red-faced, shouting at 2 sullen-looking privates who were fruitlessly trying to push the heavy vehicle. Nicholas assessed the scene in an instant. This was a moment for action, not words. He walked past the struggling men, his eyes not on the officer, but on the truck's engine, visible where the hood had been propped open. He ignored the officer's irritated glance. "The distributor cap is cracked," Nicholas said, his voice flat, his German carrying the precise, slightly formal accent of the East. He pointed a dirty finger at the engine. "You are flooding the cylinder with fuel. You will never push it out like this." The Oberleutnant, a man in his late 20s with sharp features and intelligent, frustrated eyes, stopped his shouting. He looked from the grimy civilian to the engine and back. "And you are an automotive engineer?" "I kept machines running in a Bolshevik lumber mill for 3 years," Nicholas replied, the lie dripping with bitter experience. "To survive. May I?" He didn't wait for permission. He moved to the truck, his movements economical and sure. He asked one of the privates for a wrench. His hands, those mechanic's hands, worked quickly. He didn't repair the cap. It was shattered. But he improvised. Using a strip of insulation torn from a wire, a piece of rubber from a damaged hose, and a fierce application of concentration, he sealed the crack. It was a field fix, temporary, but brilliant in its practicality. "Try it now," he said, wiping his hands on his trousers. The officer nodded to the driver. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. The two privates stared with a mix of resentment and awe. The Oberleutnant's face transformed. The frustration melted into relieved astonishment. "Where are you headed?" the officer asked, his tone now assessing. "Anywhere away from the front. I wish to serve. Properly," Nicholas said, injecting a hardness into the last word. "I am Oberleutnant Erich Emmler, 78th Infantry Division," the officer said, making a decision. "We are falling back to regroup near Vitebsk. You have just served. Get in. We can use a man who doesn't panic and can think with his hands." The ride in the back of the lorry was Nikolai's true induction. He was no longer a solitary figure, but surrounded by the smells and sounds of the Wehrmacht. Unwashed wool, cheap Schnappes breath, the metallic clatter of rifles, the rough, gallows humor banter of men who had retreated for hundreds of miles. He said little, listening, absorbing the cadences of their speech, their grievances about officers, food, the damnable mud, and the relentless Ivan. He saw his first act of cruelty not from the enemy, but from his new comrades. As they passed a burned-out village, a group of soldiers were herding a handful of bewildered, emaciated civilians, old men and women, into a ragged line. A Feldwebel was screaming questions about partisans. One old man, confused and deaf, did not respond quickly enough. The sergeant backhanded him across the face with a gloved hand, sending the man sprawling into the mud. Nicholas's body went rigid. Every instinct screamed to intervene. His fingers dug into the wooden slats of the truck bed until the splinters bit into his skin. The pain was an anchor. He forced his face into a mask of indifference, then molded that indifference into a slight, approving nod, the look of a man who understood that harshness was necessary in war. Inside, a cold, hollow space opened up. This was the price of entry. To look away was his first true betrayal. Oberleutnant Emmler, sitting across from him, noticed his reaction. Not the internal struggle, but the final composed nod. "It is a dirty business, von Berg," Miller said, lighting a cigarette. "One must be hard. The East does not understand weakness." "I have seen what happens to those who are weak," Nicholas replied, his voice a low grate. He met Miller's gaze, letting the officer see the manufactured ghosts in his eyes. "I understand perfectly." Emmler held his look for a moment, then nodded, seemingly satisfied. A bond, thin and dangerous, was formed in that moment, not of friendship, but of recognized utility and shared, assumed ideology. By nightfall, they reached the makeshift encampment of the 78th Division. It was a scene of organized chaos, tents rising in the drizzle, field kitchens steaming, the sporadic crackle of radio traffic. Emmler personally escorted Nicholas to the adjutant of his battalion. The story was told. A resourceful Volksdeutsche refugee, a mechanic, who had single-handedly saved a military vehicle. The adjutant, overworked and desperate for able-bodied men, processed him with bureaucratic haste. Within an hour, Nicholas von Berg was no longer a civilian. He was issued a uniform. The coarse gray wool felt like a shroud. The boots were stiff and cold. He was assigned to Emmler's depleted company. He had a rifle placed in his hands. The weight of it was familiar, yet utterly alien. That night, under a rain-soaked tarpaulin, surrounded by the snores and murmurs of exhausted German soldiers, Nicholas executed his first act of espionage. Using a tiny pencil and a sheet of tissue paper from a Wehrmacht-issued ration pack, he wrote in a microscopic, coded script. He recorded the division number, the battalion designation, the types and approximate number of vehicles he had seen, the demoralized mood of the troops. He noted Oberleutnant Erich Emmler, a competent and observant officer. He concealed the paper in a pre-arranged location, inside a specific, hollow fence post near a destroyed barn on the camp's eastern edge. A contact he would never see would retrieve it. The information was minor, tactical, but it was a start. As he slipped back into his bedroll, the reality of his existence crashed down. He was now a soldier in the army invading his homeland. He had worn their uniform, accepted their weapon, earned a sliver of their trust by witnessing their brutality and doing nothing. He closed his eyes, the images of the day playing against his lids, the spinning truck tires, the shattered distributor cap, the old man falling into the mud, Mahler's assessing gaze, the cold, efficient script of his message. He was inside. The wolf pack had sniffed him, and for now found him to be one of their own. The embrace was complete, and it was colder than the no-man's land he had crossed. The performance had begun, and there would be no curtain call, only the next act and the next, each one taking him deeper into the heart of the beast. Time ceased to be measured in days, but in kilometers lost, in the deepening frost, and in the ever-present taste of fear. The 78th Division was not a spearhead. It was a plug, a battered unit thrown into breaches in the crumbling German line east of Orel. For Nicholas, now a Gefreiter, the war became a brutal sensory overload of mud, exhaustion, and the constant, shrieking symphony of artillery. He learned the mechanics of survival within the machine. He learned to clean his Mauser with numb fingers, to savor the lukewarm, bitter broth of field kitchen soup, to sleep standing up during a brief lull in a freezing trench. He built a persona, brick by brick. He was quiet, reliable, and fiercely competent. He never complained about the cold or the rations. He volunteered for the dreary, dangerous tasks, standing watch in the dead of night, repairing a field telephone line under sporadic fire. His hatred for the Bolsheviks manifested as a cold, methodical efficiency in everything he did. He earned not friendship, but a grim respect. Oberleutnant Emmler's initial assessment solidified. Von Berg was a rock. The true test, the forge that would either legitimize him or break him, came during the defense of a nameless village, a cluster of izbas clinging to a frozen creek. Soviet probes had turned into a full-scale assault. The German company was outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off. Radio contact was dead. Their orders were simple: hold until a counterattack, relieve them, or die. The battle was a descent into a new circle of hell. It was not the grand warfare of movies, but a close, intimate slaughter in a landscape of burning houses and shattered fences. Nicholas fought not for Germany, but for the man next to him, and for the preservation of his own fragile legend. He fired his rifle, the kick against his shoulder a familiar, hated rhythm. He saw gray uniforms fall. He saw men he had shared sardines with just hours earlier torn apart by shrapnel, their screams swallowed by the roar of mortars. Then the order came, a desperate, near-suicidal flanking maneuver to silence a Soviet machine gun nest pinning them down in the central square. A sergeant was to lead 5 men. The sergeant took a bullet through the throat before they had moved 10 meters. The small group froze, exposed in a yard between 2 smoldering barns. A paralysis seized the survivors. The stuttering roar of the Soviet Maxim gun seemed to shake the very air. Nicholas saw it all with crystalline clarity. This was the pivot point. To hang back was to be marked a coward, to destroy the trust he had built. To move forward was likely death. But in that calculus, a cold, tactical spark ignited. The machine gun's position was in the second story of a granary. Its field of fire was wide but had a blind spot directly beneath it, near the foundation. He didn't think. The ghost of Nikolai Ivanov, the trained soldier, took over. He barked an order, his voice cutting through the din with an authority that surprised even him. "Smoke grenade! Now!" One of the stunned soldiers fumbled and threw. A thick, white cloud billowed. "With me! Stay low!" Nicholas didn't wait. He sprinted, not in a straight line, but in a jagged, unpredictable dash, using every scrap of cover. A collapsed wagon, a water trough, the corpse of a horse. Bullets chewed the earth around his feet, stitching a deadly seam in the mud. He reached the stone foundation of the granary, his back pressed against the cold rock, gasping. One other soldier, a boy of maybe 19, named Hans, made it with him, eyes wide with terror. Above them, the machine gun chattered, unaware of the threat at its feet. Nicholas pointed, gesturing violently. He mimed throwing a grenade through a window. Hans nodded, his face pale. Nicholas pulled a stick grenade from his belt, yanked the cord, counted 2 terrifying heartbeats, and lobbed it in a high arc through a small, shattered window above them. The explosion was muffled, followed by a sudden, blessed silence from the Maxim gun. But the silence was broken by shouts from inside. Russian shouts. The crew was not all dead. The back door of the granary burst open, and 2 disoriented Soviet soldiers stumbled out, weapons raised. They came face to face with Nicholas and Hans. What happened next unfolded in a brutal, time-slowed frenzy. Nicholas fired his rifle from the hip. One Soviet soldier fell. The other lunged at Hans with a bayonet. Hans froze. Nicholas's rifle was empty. He dropped it and closed the distance in 2 strides. He grabbed the Soviet soldier's rifle barrel, wrenching it sideways, as the bayonet plunged into the ground. He drove his knee into the man's stomach, then his elbow into the side of his head. It was close-quarters brutality, ugly and final. The man went down. Nicholas picked up the fallen Soviet rifle and ended the struggle with a single point-blank shot. He stood there, panting, the strange weapon hot in his hands, the smell of cordite and blood thick in the air. Hans stared at him, not with gratitude, but with something like awe and fear. The machine gun nest was silenced. The German survivors in the square, emboldened, launched a local counterattack that pushed the Soviets back just enough. Later, in the grim, exhausted aftermath, as they counted their dead and the wounded groaned in the makeshift aid station, Oberleutnant Emmeler found him. Emmeler's uniform was torn, his face smeared with soot. He looked at Nicholas for a long moment, then simply clasped his shoulder, the grip firm. "Come with me, Gefreiter von Berg," Miller said, his voice hoarse. He was led to the battalion's temporary command post, a cellar still reeking of potatoes and fear. The major, a weary man with hollow eyes, stood before a map. Emmeler recounted the action, The taking of the initiative after the sergeant's death, the silencing of the nest, the close quarters fight. He presented Nicholas not as a hero, but as a soldier whose cool head and decisive action had saved the position. The major listened, nodded, and with a tired but formal air, announced that Gefreiter Nicholas von Berg was to be awarded the Iron Cross, second class, for personal bravery and decisive action in the face of the enemy. The paperwork would be processed. There was no ceremony, no medal pinned to his chest, just the words, spoken in a damp cellar, and the formal handshake from the major. But the effect was immediate. The soldiers who heard it looked at him differently. No longer just the quiet, competent refugee, but a true warrior, one of their elite, a bearer of the Eisernes Kreuz. That night, as Nicholas sat alone on watch, staring into the black, frozen expanse where the enemy lurked, the reality of the award descended upon him like a physical weight. It was not pride he felt, but a profound, soul-crushing horror. He had been decorated for killing the men he was sworn to protect. He had saved German lives by extinguishing Soviet ones. His valor was a perfect, grotesque performance, and its prize was a symbol of everything he was supposed to destroy. He looked at his hands, still faintly stained with gunpowder and blood, both German and Soviet. They were the hands of a hero in the eyes of the men sleeping behind him, and the hands of the most profound traitor in the eyes of the men waiting in the darkness ahead. The Iron Cross, when he would eventually receive it, would not be a medal. It would be a brand, searing his legend into his flesh, binding him irrevocably to the very evil he was embedded to defeat. He had not just entered the belly of the beast, he had been metabolized by it, becoming a valued, celebrated part of its anatomy. The cold of the Russian night seeped into his bones, but it was nothing compared to the deeper, more absolute cold that had taken root in the center of his being. The Iron Cross, second class, was not a piece of metal. It was a key. It unlocked a transfer from the frozen, corpse-strewn trenches of the infantry to the relative deceptive calm of the divisional headquarters. Nicholas von Berg, war hero, was now assigned as a junior staff assistant to the operations officer of the 78th Division. The rationale was clear. A man of his proven courage, cool head, and technical mind, the mechanic's legend persisted, was too valuable to be left as mere cannon fodder. He could serve the Reich better by helping to orchestrate its defense. The headquarters was a world apart. It was housed in a requisitioned, two-story brick schoolhouse in a larger town 20 miles behind the front. Here, the war was a thing of maps, acetate overlays, typed orders, and the constant hushed chatter of teleprinters. The smell was of coffee, damp wool, cigarette smoke, and anxiety, not of mud and gangrene. Men moved with purpose, their uniforms cleaner, their faces marked by stress rather than immediate terror. For Nikolai, it was a transition from the physical hell of the front line to the psychological pressure cooker of the nerve center. His new duty was to update situation maps, process casualty reports, and manage the flow of dispatches. His desk sat in a large, high-ceilinged room where the war was reduced to symbols: blue arrows for German units, red for Soviet, each representing thousands of lives. He handled the red pins that marked reported partisan activity. He saw the blue arrows grow thinner, the red ones thicker and more numerous with each passing week. This was the treasure trove. This was what Volkov had sent him to find. He now had access to the operational picture. the exact dispositions of the division's regiments, their strength returns, the schedules for supply convoys, the coordinates for planned artillery barrages, the locations of fuel and ammunition dumps. The sheer volume of information was dizzying. He had to memorize, to synthesize, to identify what was critical. The transmission of this information became a nightly ritual of exquisite tension. His contact method was a dead drop, a camouflaged hole in the base of a specific, lightning-blasted oak in a small, neglected copse on the town's eastern outskirts. The drop was only to be used on specific days of the week, marked by innocuous chalk signals on a nearby fence. Each journey to the oak was a walk on a razor's edge. He carried the intelligence encoded on tiny rice paper squares, concealed in a hollowed-out button of his uniform tunic. The information was priceless. The planned German defensive line at Kursk, codenamed Operation Citadel, the spots in their armor, the timetable for the arrival of the new Panther battalions. As he walked through the quiet, occupied town, past blacked-out windows and the occasional patrol, every casual glance from a passing soldier felt like an accusation. Every sound in the dark made his heart stutter. The iron cross on his chest, which he now wore, felt like a beacon, drawing the eyes of any observer. But the greater danger was not outside. It was inside the headquarters, in the form of Major Kraus of the Abwehr, the military intelligence service. Kraus was a spare, ascetic man in his 50s with a gaze like a dissection tool. He moved through the rooms silently, observing, never quite participating in the frantic operational work. He was an auditor of men, not of battles. His presence was a cold draft in the room. Kraus took a particular quiet interest in the new hero from the front. His compliments were always phrased as questions. Remarkable initiative for a refugee with no formal military training, Gefreiter von Berg. Or, your file from Riga is surprisingly sparse. The chaos of the times, I suppose. The questions were needles, probing for inconsistencies in the tapestry of his legend. Nicholas answered with the flat, unadorned truth of his fabricated past, but he could feel Kraus's eyes on him, weighing, measuring, never satisfied. The moral cost of his espionage became horrifically personal. One afternoon, a frantic dispatch arrived from a frontline regiment. They had walked into a devastating Soviet artillery ambush at a river crossing. An entire company was annihilated, their position pinpointed with impossible accuracy. The location was one Nicholas had transmitted 48 hours prior. He read the casualty list, the typed names already smudged with the clerk's sweat. Halfway down was Unteroffizier Hans Bauer, the boy from the granary, the one who had stared at him with awe. Nicholas felt the room tilt. The chatter of the teleprinters faded to a distant roar. He saw Hans's young, frightened face in the smoke of the village. He had not pulled the trigger on the artillery piece, but his hands had guided the shell. He excused himself, walked to the latrine, and was violently, silently sick. He splashed icy water on his face, staring at the ghost in the cracked mirror. The German hero, the Soviet weapon. The two selves warred in his reflection, and the victor was a hollow-eyed stranger. That night, the journey to the dead drop was agony. The button over his heart felt like it weighed a ton. He placed the new information, details of a panzer division being pulled from the line to refit, creating a critical weakness, into the oak's hidden cavity. As he did, he saw, in his mind's eye, Not Soviet commanders using the information, but German boys like Hans, confused and terrified as T-34s erupted from a flank they thought was secure. He was not just passing information. He was drawing a target on the backs of men who called him comrade, who had shared their bread and their fears with him. Returning, he passed a barracks, where off-duty soldiers were drinking and singing a mournful folk song. One of them, a corporal from his old company, spotted him and waved him over, offering a bottle. "Von Berg, our hero, come, drink with us." Nicholas forced a smile, the most difficult performance of his life. He took a swig of the harsh schnapps, the burn in his throat a welcome punishment. He laughed at a crude joke. He listened to their complaints. He was one of them. And with every second he spent in their fraternity, the act of betrayal deepened. He was no longer just a spy in enemy territory. He had become an architect of ruin, designing the collapse of the very world in which he was a decorated citizen. The maps in the headquarters were no longer abstract. They were blueprints for a slaughterhouse, and he was ensuring the doors were left unlocked. Major Krause's silent suspicion was a tangible threat. But the crushing daily guilt of being both the savior and the destroyer of these men was a far heavier, more intimate prison. The pressure from Moscow became a silent, screaming force in Nikolai's mind. The intelligence he provided was deemed so valuable that the demand evolved from passive observation to active sabotage. The orders, decrypted from a one-time pad communique, left in the dead drop, were chillingly specific. A key bridge over the Desna River, a vital artery for German reinforcements heading to the crumbling Central Front, was to be rendered unusable. The method was to be industrial sabotage disguised as partisan activity, but the execution required an insider to misdirect and cripple the repair efforts. This was no longer the transmission of faceless coordinates. This was direct, kinetic treason. It meant ensuring the failure and likely death of the engineers and guards at that bridge. It meant strangling his own comrades at the front. Nikolai spent a sleepless night wrestling with the ghost of Volkov, whose voice in his memory was merciless. "You are a weapon. A weapon does not choose its targets. It is aimed." He chose his instrument with cold, devastating precision. The target was Sergeant Rolf Steiner, the chief engineer of the Divisional Pioneer Battalion. Steiner was a competent, bullish man, but with a fatal flaw: a well-known carelessness, with security protocols and a fondness for local moonshine that left him foggy-headed during early inspections. Nikolai's plan was not to frame an innocent, but to exploit the guilty carelessness of a man whose negligence was already a quiet scandal. Using his access to the logistics schedule, Nikolai identified a shipment of specialized timber girders, critical for the bridge repair. He subtly altered the routing slip in the paperwork stack, redirecting the convoy to a depot 30 kilometers off course. It was a small, plausible clerical error in the chaos of retreat. He then, during the night watch, accessed the Pioneer Battalion's duty roster and ensured Steiner was assigned to oversee the initial damage assessment at the bridge at dawn. The following morning, he accompanied Major Krause on a routine inspection tour, a coincidence he had carefully engineered by mentioning congestion on the alternate route. As their K-Bellwagen approached the bridge, the scene of controlled chaos confirmed his predictions. Sergeant Steiner was there, red-faced and shouting, already behind schedule. The girders were nowhere to be found. A furious phone call revealed the misrouted convoy. Steiner's incompetence was now on full, spectacular display in front of an Abwehr officer. Kraus observed the meltdown with detached interest. He said nothing, but his eyes missed nothing. Steiner's panic, the delayed repair timeline, the vulnerable gap in the German logistics chain now exposed for at least 48 hours. Nikolai stood beside him, his face a mask of professional concern. Inside, he felt nothing but a vast, hollow cold. The consequence was swift and brutal. Military justice in a retreating army was summary. Sergeant Steiner was arrested not for sabotage, but for criminal negligence and suspected drunkenness on duty. The evidence was circumstantial, but damning, neatly compiled by Nikolai's invisible hand. A court-martial was convened that very afternoon in the schoolhouse's former gymnasium. It was a grim, hurried affair. The need for a scapegoat was palpable. The bridge was still down. The front needed reinforcements. Nikolai was called to testify. He stood before the assembled officers, the accused Steiner, staring at him with a mixture of confusion and dawning hatred. Nikolai gave his testimony. He stated facts. The altered routing slip found in the logistics office, the duty roster showing Steiner's assignment, the absence of the materials. He presented them in a neutral, factual tone. He did not need to accuse. The facts, as he presented them, formed their own noose. He never mentioned the moonshine. He didn't have to. The presiding officer, a colonel with bags under his eyes, asked if Gefreiter von Berg had any reason to believe this was deliberate sabotage. Nikolai looked straight at Steiner, then back at the colonel. "I have seen sabotage, Herr Oberst. This has the hallmark of tragic negligence." The word negligence was the final nail. It was more damning than malice. It spoke of a failure of the German soldier's sacred duty. Steiner was found guilty. The sentence for undermining the war effort in a time of crisis was death by firing squad. He was to be executed at dawn. The execution was not a private affair. It was a demonstration. The entire headquarters staff, including Nikolai, was ordered to witness it in the schoolyard, a bleak lesson in the cost of failure. The morning was gray and drizzling. Steiner, stripped of his insignia, was marched out. His eyes scanned the rigid faces of the assembled men. They passed over Nikolai, and for a fraction of a second they held. There was no plea in them, only a shattered understanding. He knew. He may not have known how, but in that final moment he knew he had been sacrificed. The shots rang out, sharp and final in the damp air. Steiner crumpled. Nikolai did not flinch. He held his stance, his face carved from stone, a model of stoic discipline. Beside him, Oberleutnant Müller, now a captain, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. After the dismissed formation, as they walked back to the map room, Emmler spoke, his voice low and devoid of its usual camaraderie. "A hard thing to watch, even for a man like Steiner." He paused, lighting a cigarette. His next words were not a question, but a statement laid bare between them. "Sometimes, Nicholas, I look at you, at the efficiency, the perfect correctness, and I wonder. I truly wonder whose side you are really on." The air froze in Nikolai's lungs. This was not Kraus's intellectual suspicion. This was the visceral doubt of a man who had fought beside him, who owed him his life. It was far more dangerous. He turned to face Emmler, meeting his gaze squarely. He let the silence stretch for a beat, allowing the shadow of the executed man to hang between them. Then he answered, his voice low, ironclad, and dripping with a conviction forged in 1,000 rehearsals. "I am on the side of Germany, Captain. Only Germany. Chaos and failure are the enemy. I remove them where I find them." He held Miller's gaze, letting the officer see the fanatic's cold fire he had meticulously cultivated. He saw the doubt in Miller's eyes waver, then recede, not dispelled, but buried under the weight of Nikolai's performed certainty and the ghastly, fresh evidence of his loyalty. A loyal man would not flinch at the removal of a rotten limb. Mahler gave a slow, shallow nod and walked on. Alone in the latrine minutes later, Nikolai finally broke. Not with tears, but with a violent, silent tremor that seized his entire body. He gripped the edge of the sink, his knuckles white, staring at the water swirling down the drain. He had not just transmitted information. He had not just witnessed death from a distance. He had engineered a man's murder. He had looked into the eyes of a comrade and condemned him to a grave, all to keep the fragile edifice of his own lies standing. Steiner was guilty of carelessness, but his real crime was being a convenient pawn. Nikolai had become more than a spy. He was now an executioner for the cause he was betraying. The ghost of Sergeant Steiner would now join the ghost of young Hans, forever standing in the hollow space where Nikolai Ivanov's soul used to be. The circle of his damnation was complete. He was not just living a lie, he was the lie, and it demanded blood sacrifice to sustain itself. The Eastern Front in the autumn of 1944 was not a line, but a bleeding wound, a ragged, collapsing scab being torn westward by an inexorable red tide. The 78th Division, or what was left of it, was a fragment of that scab, perpetually retreating, digging in, and retreating again. The schoolhouse headquarters was abandoned for a succession of increasingly squalid command posts. A manor house cellar, a brick factory office thick with ceramic dust, finally a complex of damp, sandbag-reinforced dugouts in the forests of East Prussia. The air of professional anxiety curdled into something thicker, more primal, a fog of latent panic and grim fatalism. Major Krauss of the Abwehr thrived in this miasma. As the military situation deteriorated, his internal hunt for the cause, the traitor, the saboteur, the weak link, became an obsession. The executed Sergeant Steiner's case, instead of being closed, festered in his mind. The perfection of the failure gnawed at him. It was too clean, too timely. His suspicion, once a wandering searchlight, now focused into a laser beam on the one man whose rise had been as meteoric as it was improbable. The heroic refugee, Gefreiter Nikolaus von Berg. Krause began his campaign not with confrontation, but with exquisite psychological pressure. Nikolai would find his personal effects in his bunk, subtly disturbed. A journal not quite at the same angle, the contents of his washing kit, minutely rearranged. Krause would engage him in casual conversation, then pivot into sudden, probing questions about Riga's street layouts or the technical specifications of Latvian lumber mill machinery, watching his eyes for a microsecond of hesitation. He assigned Nikolai to compile after-action reports on engagements where Soviet artillery had been suspiciously accurate, forcing him to document, in clinical detail, the catastrophic results of his own espionage. The noose truly tightened on a bitter, rain-swept afternoon. Krause summoned Nikolai to his makeshift office, a corner of the dugout partitioned by a stained canvas sheet. The space reeked of damp earth and cold cigarettes. On Krause's desk lay a file. Next to it, held between Krause's thin fingers, was the tiny rice paper square Nikolai had placed in the dead drop oak 48 hours earlier. It was empty, The cipher already extracted, but its very existence was a death sentence. Nikolai's blood turned to ice. He stopped breathing. Every survival instinct screamed to run, to fight, to deny. But the ghost of Volkov whispered, "Stand. They have the paper, not the man." "A curious thing," Kraus began, his voice like dry leaves rustling. "Found by a patrol, in a most inventive location. The cipher was child's play, coordinates for our artillery park near Gumbinen." He placed the paper down, his eyes never leaving Nikolai's face. "The hunt for the rat begins. But a rat needs a hole, a contact, perhaps a sympathetic local. Or," he let the word hang, "a comrade with a talent for being in the right place to see everything, and the wrong place in his past." He did not accuse. He opened the file. It contained a single grainy photograph, pushed across the desk. It showed a man in a Soviet uniform, his face partially turned, being led away by two NKVD guards. The context was unclear, but the caption, typed below, was not "Possible GRU operative, Smolensk sector, 1941, file incomplete." The man in the photo bore a passing, haunting resemblance to Nikolai. The build, the set of the shoulders. It was not him, but in the paranoid logic of a hunt, it could be. It was a seed of doubt, meticulously planted. "We have a fresh catch from a reconnaissance patrol last night," Kraus said, his tone conversational. "A Soviet scout. He's been persuaded to talk. He claims to know of a high-level source within this very division. I want you to sit in on the interrogation, Gefreiter von Berg. Your perspective, from the front line, might be illuminating." This was the trap, laid with cruel genius. Nikolai was to be an observer at his own potential unmasking. He was marched to a separate, smaller dugout, its entrance guarded by two stony-faced Feldgendarmerie. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and fear. A single bulb swung from a wire, casting jumping shadows. Tied to a chair in the center was a young man in a tattered, mud-caked Soviet uniform. His face was a swollen, bloody mask. One eye was sealed shut. He was barely conscious. Kraus took a seat in the shadows, gesturing for Nikolai to stand beside him, under the light. A hulking sergeant from the Feldgendarmerie stood by the prisoner, his hands thick and meaty. "Continue," Kraus said softly. The sergeant grabbed the prisoner's hair, yanking his head up. "The source, the name." The prisoner groaned, his one good eye fluttering open. It swept the room, unfocused, passing over Kraus, over the sergeant, and landing on Nikolai. On his clean uniform, his intact face, the iron cross at his throat. The eye seemed to sharpen, to focus with a desperate, terrifying intensity. Nikolai's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped animal. He didn't know this man. Was he GRU? A real scout? A desperate liar? The silence stretched, filled only with the prisoner's ragged breath. The prisoner's lips, cracked and bleeding, moved. He whispered something in Russian, too faint to hear. "Louder!" the sergeant barked, shaking him. The prisoner's eye locked on Nikolai's. He spoke again, a rasping, clear sentence in Russian. "The dawn, the red dawn, comes for you all." It was a partisan slogan, a meaningless, defiant curse. But in the context of Kraus's trap, it was a moment of pure, suspended terror. Was it a coded signal, a recognition, a final act of misdirection from a brave man? Kraus watched Nikolai, not the prisoner. He was studying every twitch of his facial muscle, the dilation of his pupils, the control of his breath. Nikolai knew this. He forced himself to react, not with the panic of a spy recognized, but with the cold, contemptuous anger of a German officer, hearing the enemy's impotent defiance. He let a sneer twist his lips. He turned his gaze from the prisoner to Kraus, his expression one of impatience. "He knows nothing, Major. A fanatic throwing slogans. A waste of time." His voice was flat, dismissive. If he had a name, he would have sold it by now to stop this. Kraus held his gaze for an eternity. The only sounds were the drip of water in the dugout and the prisoner's pained breathing. Finally, Kraus gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the sergeant. "He is of no further use." The sergeant drew his pistol. Nikolai did not look away. He kept his eyes on Kraus, a show of cold strength. The shot in the confined space was deafening, a final brutal period to the scene. The prisoner's body jerked, then sagged. Nikolai remained perfectly still, the echo of the gunshot ringing in his bones. He had passed the test. He had not broken. He had condemned another man to death with his performance. But as he left the dugout, the cold, damp air of the forest hitting his face, he knew with absolute certainty that he had not convinced Kraus. He had merely confirmed the Major's belief that he was a formidable, dangerous opponent. The trap had not snapped shut, but the mechanism was now primed. The hunt was no longer general. It was personal, and the hunter was patient, brilliant, and utterly without mercy. The fragile link to Moscow was severed with the discovery of the dead drop. Nikolai was now completely alone, isolated in the heart of the disintegrating beast, with the one man who truly saw him circling closer, waiting for the single, inevitable mistake. The walls of his legend, once a fortress, now felt like a prison cell slowly flooding with ice-cold water. The collapse was no longer strategic. It was physiological. The mighty Wehrmacht in the east was a body in septic shock, its limbs dying, its nerves firing useless signals of defiance as the corps failed. The 78th Division ceased to exist as a coherent formation. It was now a Kampfgruppe, a battle group, a ragged collection of shattered companies, panzer grenadiers without vehicles, artillerymen without guns, and headquarters staff who now carried rifles. They fell back into the frozen ancient forests and bleak fields of East Prussia, a landscape that offered no solace, only a deeper, more intimate stage for the final act. Nikolai, still attached to the skeletal command structure, was no longer a clerk of maps, but a soldier again. The Iron Cross First Class, awarded in a somber, rushed ceremony in a barn for his continued exemplary leadership and resilience, now weighed like an anvil on his uniform. It was a cruel joke of cosmic proportions, a testament to the perfection of his damnation. He was Captain Nicholas von Berg, a title bestowed in the desperate hope that symbols of rank could somehow halt the Soviet avalanche. The reality was a waking nightmare of ice, exhaustion, and constant, gnawing fear. They dug shallow trenches in the iron-hard earth, their breath pluming in the relentless cold. They existed on frozen bread, ersatz coffee, and the last dregs of discipline. The enemy was no longer a red arrow on a map. It was the distant rumble of T-34 engines through the pines, the sudden shrieking arrival of Katyusha rockets that turned the forest into a hell of splinters and fire, the sporadic rattle of machine gun fire that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. In this cauldron of despair, a terrible, unexpected alchemy occurred. The men, these hollow-eyed boys and weary veterans, began to look to him. Not to the distant, invisible generals, but to him, Captain von Berg, the hero from the front, the calm presence from headquarters, who now shared their frozen hole, who never complained, who seemed to possess an endless reserve of grim, practical resolve. He knew how to pack a wound with snow to slow bleeding. He could divine the direction of an artillery barrage by sound alone. He would take the dangerous watch, letting others sleep. He moved through the chaos with a silent, unshakable certainty that was, in truth, the absolute certainty of a man who had already lost everything, including his own soul. One particularly vicious night, a Soviet probing attack breached their crumbling line. Panic flickered through the position. A young lieutenant, his voice cracking with terror, fumbled his orders. In the confusion, Nikolai acted. He did not shout. He moved. He grabbed a machine gun from a fallen gunner, shoved the trembling lieutenant towards the wounded, and laid down a precise, murderous field of fire at the enemy's flank. It was not a grand, heroic charge, but a brutal, efficient piece of butchery that broke the attack's momentum. As the Soviets fell back, a stunned silence fell over the German position, broken only by the moans of the wounded. In that silence, a grimy, blood-spattered corporal, a man who had been with them since Smolensk, looked at Nikolai as he cooled the smoking barrel. The man's eyes were not filled with awe for a hero, but with something far more devastating: raw, human gratitude. "Thank you, Herr Captain," the man whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "With you here, we feel we might actually live through this." Those words were a knife to Nikolai's heart, sharper than any bayonet. With you here, he was their talisman, their rock. The very lies that sustained his mission had forged him into a genuine leader of men. Men he was systematically betraying with every scrap of information he had ever sent. Men whose deaths he had indirectly caused. Men who now vested in him their fragile hope for survival. He found a shattered mirror in an abandoned farmhouse they were looting for firewood. He looked into it. The face that stared back was a stranger. It was the face of Captain von Berg, older, harder, with lines of command and suffering etched around the eyes and mouth. The eyes themselves were the worst. They were not the eyes of Nikolai Ivanov, the idealistic spy. They were the cold, flinty, resolute eyes of a German officer who had seen too much and would do whatever was necessary. The uniform, the medals, the dirt, the authority, it was all a perfect fit. The costume had consumed the actor. That night, under a sky ablaze with the reflected glow of a burning town on the horizon, he attempted one last, futile act of connection to his real self. Using a stolen pencil and a scrap of map from a dead officer's pocket, he wrote a message. Not in the sterile, precise code of military intelligence, but in clear, desperate Russian. It was not a report. It was a confession. I have forgotten my own face. Only the mask remains. But the mask remembers why it was put on. The shadow knows its purpose. He had no way to send it. No dead drop, no contact. The link to Moscow was a severed umbilical cord. He was a ghost in the German machine, a phantom with no home to return to. He folded the paper and buried it in the frozen earth beneath his sleeping spot. A pathetic grave for his dying identity. The final grotesque affirmation came the next morning. A general, touring the collapsing front in a mud-spattered staff car, stopped at their position. He was handing out meaningless medals and hollow encouragement. He saw Nikolai's Iron Cross, heard the murmured legend of the refugee-turned-hero from the men. The general clasped Nikolai's shoulder, his grip like iron, his face a mask of performative inspiration. "Men like you, Captain von Berg, are the iron core of Germany. You are what we are fighting for. You are the true face of our resistance." Nikolai stood rigid, accepting the praise, his eyes looking past the general to the smoldering horizon where his real army advanced. He was the true face of their resistance. And that was the most horrifying truth of all. He had not just infiltrated the enemy. He had, through a monstrous twist of fate and his own terrifying competence, become one of its most potent symbols. He was no longer a spy playing a role. He was the role, and the role was a German war hero, leading his men to a grave he had helped dig. The isolation was now absolute, a vast, silent tundra within him, where the howling wind was the echo of his own erased self. Berlin in April of 1945 was not a city. It was a dying organism convulsing in its final moments. The air was a permanent acrid fog of smoke, powdered brick, and burned flesh. The symphony of war was now a cacophony at point-blank range. The crump of Soviet mortars, the staccato rip of machine guns from every window, the deafening apocalyptic roar of collapsing buildings. The Kampfgruppe was reduced to a handful of ghosts assigned to defend a single, shattered intersection. A pointless footnote in the battle plan of a vanished Reich. Nikolai moved through the ruins as if already dead. The crisp Captain von Berg was gone, replaced by a figure of grime and blood, his uniform in tatters, the iron cross hanging from a thread. His eyes, the eyes of the mask, scanned the hellscape with automatic, tactical clarity. But behind them, Nikolai Ivanov was a silent, waiting void. The mission was over. The war was lost. Only the dying remained. It was here, in the final circle of this hell, that all the threads of his double life converged with violent, cruel inevitability. He found Erich Emmler, his old comrade, the man whose doubt had once been so dangerous, in the rubble of a pharmacy. Emmler was propped against an overturned cabinet, a dark, wet stain spreading across his lower abdomen. His face was pale as chalk, his breathing shallow. When he saw Nikolai, his eyes glazed with pain, focused with a last, startling intensity. "Nicolas," he rasped, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Knew you'd be the last man standing. The Rock." A cough racked him, bringing flecks of blood to his lips. "Don't let them take me, not alive. You understand? Do it as a friend." The plea was a final, unbearable bond. The man who had sensed the lie now asked the lie for the ultimate act of twisted mercy. Nikolai knelt, his hand going to his sidearm, a cold, heavy Luger. This was the final, logical conclusion of his legend: to execute a friend for the fatherland. Before his fingers could close on the grip, a figure emerged from the swirling dust of a nearby alley. It was Major Krauss, but the ascetic intelligence officer was gone. In his place was a feral, desperate animal. His uniform was torn, one sleeve bloody, but in his hand he held a Walther P-38, and it was leveled unwaveringly at Nikolai's chest. "Step away from the Captain, von Berg," Krauss snarled, his voice hoarse and cracked. "Or whatever your name is." His eyes, burning with a fanatic's final clarity, darted between Nikolai and the wounded Emmler. "I have no evidence. I need none. I have the certainty. You are the cancer, the architect of our ruin, and before this ends, you will confess. You will tell me how you did it. You will give me the names." This was not an interrogation. It was a last, personal exorcism. Krauss needed to give the catastrophe a name, and he had chosen Nikolai's. The pistol in his hand did not waver. Behind him, the sounds of close combat erupted. The guttural shouts in Russian, the answering screams in German. The Soviet tide was washing into the street, block by brutal block. Nikolai remained kneeling, his body positioned between Emmler and Krauss's gun. He was at the nexus of three destinies: the dying friend who believed in the mask, the vengeful hunter who saw through it, and the advancing Red Army that was his true homeland. He looked at Emmler, seeing the trust in the man's fading eyes, a trust earned through 1,000 shared horrors and lies. He looked at Krauss, seeing the hollow triumph of a man about to win a meaningless victory at the end of the world. He heard the Soviet soldiers, his liberators, who would see only a German officer in a ruined uniform and shoot him on sight. Time compressed. There was no grand strategy, no final message to Moscow. There was only the raw calculus of the moment, stripped of ideology, stripped of pretense. He moved. His hand did not go for his own Luger. Instead, it shot out and grabbed a handful of grit and shattered plaster from the floor. In one fluid motion, he rose and flung the debris into Krauss's face. Krauss flinched, his gun hand jerking upward. Nikolai closed the distance, not like a trained spy, but like a street fighter. He slammed his body into Krauss, driving him back against the crumbling wall. He grabbed the wrist of Krauss's gun hand, smashing it against the brick. The Walther clattered to the ground. Krauss fought with the strength of the damned, his fingers clawing for Nikolai's eyes. They grappled in the dust, two ghosts fighting over a corpse of a cause. Nikolai felt no anger, only a cold, focused necessity. He drove his knee again and again into Krauss's injured side. The major gasped, his strength ebbing. Nikolai wrenched himself free, leaving Krauss slumped against the wall, gasping. He turned back to Emmler. The captain's eyes were half closed. Nikolai did not reach for his Luger. Instead, he ripped a field dressing from his own tunic and pressed it against Emmler's wound, applying pressure. It was a futile, compassionate act, a human act, the act of the man beneath the mask, for no audience but a dying enemy. A burst of submachine gun fire chewed up the pharmacy counter above them. Soviet soldiers were in the doorway, silhouetted against the fiery hell outside. They shouted commands in Russian. "Ruki vverk! Hands up!" Nikolai froze, his bloodied hands still on Emmler's wound. He looked at the Soviet soldiers, young, fierce, their faces smeared with soot and triumph. They were his people, the men he had sacrificed everything to help. One of them, a sergeant, stepped forward, his PPSH-41 trained squarely on Nikolai's chest. His eyes took in the scene, the German officer tending to another. The older major slumped and defeated. He saw the tattered uniform, the Iron Cross. "Officer?" the Soviet sergeant barked in heavily accented German. "You! Stand, now!" Nikolai slowly raised his hands. He stood, turning to face them. In that moment, he made his final choice. He did not speak Russian. He did not reveal himself. To do so would be a death sentence for the unconscious Emmler, and likely for himself in the chaotic, vengeful frenzy of the battle's end. The mask had to hold, one last time. He stood as Captain Nicholas von Berg, a defeated enemy. He met the sergeant's gaze with the flinty, resigned stare of a professional soldier who knew the war was over. Behind him, Krauss, from his heap on the floor, found one last breath. He pointed a trembling, accusing finger at Nikolai and hissed a single blood-choked word in German. "Verter." Traitor. The Soviet sergeant glanced at the raving, broken old man, then back at the stoic, wounded officer before him. He dismissed Krauss's rant as the madness of a defeated Nazi. He gestured sharply with his weapon, directing Nikolai out into the street with the other prisoners. As Nikolai was pushed out into the maelstrom, his hands on his head, he took one last look over his shoulder. He saw Emmeller, left for dead or capture. He saw Krauss, consumed by a truth no one would ever believe. Then the smoke and dust swallowed the pharmacy whole. He was marched down the corpse-littered street, a gray figure in a river of gray prisoners, surrounded by the greenish-gray coats of his victorious countrymen. The weight of the Iron Cross was finally gone, torn away in the struggle. He was nobody. Not a hero, not a spy, not a savior, not a traitor. He was a ghost, stepping out of one nightmare and into the uncertain silence of the next. He had lived the most perfect lie, and in the end, the lie was all that remained. A shell walking into captivity, leaving the truth buried under the rubble of Berlin, with the only men who had ever come close to seeing it. The performance was over, but the curtain would never fall, because the audience was dead, and the actor had forgotten his own name.